Hello, my friends. It is day 328, and we're reading Galatians chapter 1 through Galatians chapter 3. But before we get into our recap today, I want to thank you for taking a moment to check out this video. Hopefully, you're finding the yearly Bible reading program enjoyable, and I hope you are gaining a lot out of it. If you have not yet accepted the invitation to be a part of this group, please check out www.selflesschurch.org, and you'll find the registration button on the homepage, and you'll be able to register and become up to date or keep up with all the things we're going to do in the upcoming year. We're going to have a lot of gatherings and reading and studying and all those great things, and I just look forward to you being a part of it. So today we entered into another book, and as we are discovering the book of Acts, once it gets into the ministry of Paul, we see that there are a lot of movements between different places, a lot of different letters that are being written in order to address some of the concerns that the believers have in these new communities that are being established. And I think it's just such an amazing and interesting detail to acknowledge whenever we read through these passages in the book of Acts, how these churches are experiencing different scenarios and different concerns as we see them form. I mean, you understand that these are new converts, people who have never ever had an opportunity to live together in the way that they're living. And as you would imagine, there are a lot of concerns that these new believers would have about what does it mean to live in this new identity that is given to them by Jesus Christ. One of the things that we often see in Paul's letters, and what we will see, we haven't seen it yet, but we will see, is his, great concern for false prophets and false doctrine. And he is so critical of and aware of this danger that he can't hardly write a letter without referencing it. And we see that very explicitly in the book of Galatians. A few things stood out to me. First, just Paul's testimony concerning Jesus Christ and his own conversion. Chapter 2 talked about, chapter 1 going into chapter 2 talked about how Paul used to persecute the church, and then he became a believer, and then he went basically straight to the mission field to find as many people as he could to bring into the kingdom of God. And it's just, you hear this in various ways. You hear it in the book of Acts. You hear of it in Philippians. You hear it again here in Galatians. But each time we see a very common thread, and that is Paul is called to walk away from the Jewish way of living to embrace a new way of living that is defined and exampled by Jesus Christ. And the way he tells it, he was picked to do this, right? So it's not just simply that he was a convert that came to know Christ and he had this zeal that one. No, this is a matter of, I had no desire to do this, but God picked me to actually serve in this role, and I can't avoid, ignore, or diminish the call that God that he has on my life. I think this is important because I think a lot of times people, and I said this at one point in one of our Bible studies, but people are content with being converted when what God intends for us to do is recognize our calling. And it is not through conversion that we live our life. It is through calling that we live our life. We are called to do something in this world. And Paul seemingly got that more than anyone. He wouldn't let it down. He would not live it down. He embraced it fully. And we see in the latter part of chapter 1, going to chapter 2, that he was so committed to this call to win the nations to Jesus that he went through whatever he needed to go through to do that. We also see that there was a bit of a confrontation, and I say that in the most positive way. I don't mean like a contentious confrontation. I mean simply Paul confronts Peter about his hypocritical practices and ways and fellowship. Peter was dealing with the Gentiles just fine until the Jews showed up, and then he tried to act like he had no dealings with them. And something as simple as eating becomes a gospel issue. And I want you to let that sink in for a moment. Like who you eat with, how you fellowship is a gospel issue. When you find yourself not willing to involve yourself or fellowship with people because of some sort of secondary preference, and you know that there's unity and there is agreement around the gospel of Jesus Christ, that is a gospel issue. Because while you may be speaking the gospel, you're not living it. And Paul makes it clear here that it's not good enough to simply share the gospel with our words, but it is our responsibility to live that gospel out in faithful community and in our lives personally. So he called him out on it, and Paul obviously becomes some sort of authority in that respect, because Peter, of course, was one of the original. And excuse me, we know the example that Peter had among the earliest believers. And so for Paul to be able to do that speaks a lot about how he's perceived and how his influence is spreading. It also speaks to the fact that he must have had a bunch of courage, because hardly anyone would take that path if given an opportunity. But it just goes to show you. Now, in chapter 3, it's just such a great contrast between the law and between faith, and then again between the law and the promises that God gave us through faith in Jesus Christ. And ultimately, what Paul argues here is that a person who lives by faith can no longer put their commitment or their conviction or their trust, should I even say, in the law. That means the works of the law, meaning the circumcision, the old covenant way. These are not just singular terms meant to identify one single act. It is a broad way of speaking about a phenomena that has been enjoyed over centuries. And when we hear words like law, works, old covenant, these things embody circumcision even. These things embody such a grand and broad stroke of ideas that we can hardly single out one single practice or concept and think we're nailing it. And that's the thing about Paul that we see over and over again. Sometimes it's clear, like in Galatians. Sometimes it's a little more difficult to comprehend in cases such as what we read in Romans. But either way, we understand that this is a contrast of two different ways, two different prophets, two different manners of life. In one respect, you have Moses, the old covenant, the temple system. In the other sense, you have Jesus, faith, and the spiritual community. And this is all turning everything Paul knew upside down. And here he is trying to explain this to the church in Galatia. So we're going to continue to see one of his biggest issues with the church in Galatia is that they are easily convinced to go back into what they've been brought out of. Okay. And this is what we saw in chapter 1, and it serves as the premise for everything else we read throughout the book of Galatians. So we have a few more chapters to go. I'd love to know what you think about it. Please leave your comments in the comment box below, and hopefully it'll stimulate some great conversation. Until next time, thank you for watching. Take care. God bless. And remember, live by the word.